The Allied bombing campaign against Romanian oil refineries was bleeding the U.S. 15th Air Force dry. By August 1944, nearly half the bomber fleet, 350 aircraft, had been shot down over the Balkans. Hundreds of American airmen were scattered across Nazi-occupied territory, officially listed as missing in action. In Washington, families received telegrams stating their sons were missing and presumed lost. The War Department had written them off. But in a remote mountain clearing near the village of Pranjani, Serbian peasants were moving massive stones by hand, filling potholes with stream gravel and clearing trees, building an airfield, one shovelful at a time. The project defied all military logic. Transport aircraft had never attempted to land in such terrain. The makeshift runway was surrounded by German patrols hunting for downed airmen. Bounties turned every neighbor into a potential executioner. Yet more than 500 Allied airmen were counting on peasants with ox carts to accomplish what the most powerful military in history could not: flying through fire. After Italy's fall in autumn 1943, the skies over the Balkans became a lethal gauntlet. The U.S. 15th Air Force, stationed at airfields near Foggia, launched daily bombing runs against Hitler's most precious resource, Romanian oil. The polyester refineries alone provided 1/4 of the Reich's fuel, making them prime targets in the Allied oil campaign. Starting in the spring of 1944, vast formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators roared across the skies, their thunderous engines cutting through clouds as they swept eastward over the Adriatic, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The landscape below trembled under relentless bombardment, but the skies grew more dangerous with each mission. The toll was staggering. By August, 350 bombers had been lost, nearly half the fleet, as ruthless German fighters prowled the air, striking down crippled, slow-moving bombers. Liberators, vulnerable and heavy, often fell over German-occupied Serbia, their crews forced to leap into hostile terrain. Among those who parachuted to earth near Toplica, 9 airmen found salvation with the Chetniks, a royalist guerrilla band fiercely loyal to General Draža Mihailović, born from resistance after the Axis invasion and rooted deep in western Serbia's rugged mountains. As the bombing campaign grew fiercer, so did the quiet heroism on the ground. By July, more than 100 stranded American airmen hid in Chetnik-controlled lands, evading German bounties. Serbian peasants risked everything, sheltering these strangers in humble homes, sharing scant rations, while crude hospitals took shape in the village of Pranjani. The fall. At altitude, the leather flight suit offered the only shield against the freezing air. Claire Musgrove, wedged into the ball turret beneath the belly of the B-24 Liberator, wasn't supposed to be there at all. A gunnery instructor by trade, he'd volunteered to fill in for a missing gunner on this, his 11th mission. The cramped aluminum sphere housing him barely allowed movement, with twin 50-caliber Browning M2s slaved to pistol-grip triggers. The turret could swing on a wide 180-degree arc, but if power failed, the only way out was to hand-crank it back into position. Musgrove would later recall, quote, "It was a very difficult place to remove yourself from if you didn't have power." The parachute didn't fit inside. Standard procedure was to stash it just outside, close enough to grab in an emergency. But when flak over the target ripped through the B-24's fuselage and took out 2 of the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, emergency procedure blurred into chaos. The aircraft staggered. Then a 3rd engine failed. His lieutenant sounded the alarm, with Musgrove remembering, quote, "I had to hand-crank the turret up and get out. That took me a while. Then I couldn't find my parachute, so that made me panic a bit." While the rest of the crew bailed out and were quickly captured by German patrols sweeping the area, Musgrove's delay threw off the search. His chute opened far from the others, drifting across Serbian hills and scrub valleys. In the seconds of free fall, he spotted sheep on a hillside and made a split-second decision. He recalled thinking, quote, "If I ever get on the ground, that's where I'm going to head out, because sheep and humans go together." His parachute billowed open, jolting him, and he began to drift down toward the hostile landscape. Staying alive meant more than finding shelter. It meant figuring out how to reach Allied forces who could get him out and bring him home. Thousands of miles away, In a quiet office in Washington, someone was already trying to do just that. A letter home. In 1944, Mirjana Vujnović was working at the Yugoslav embassy in Washington, D.C., far from the war-torn streets of Belgrade, from where she and her husband George had fled 3 years earlier. She had once escaped Axis-controlled Europe thanks to an improbable act of mercy. Magda Goebbels, of all people, had waved her through a Bulgarian checkpoint when she lacked a passport. One afternoon, a report came through the embassy from Yugoslavia. Serbian guerrillas were sheltering hundreds of downed American airmen in barns, caves, and mountain villages. The information came from General Mihailović's command and included names and addresses of the missing men, soldiers officially listed as MIA. To Mirjana, this wasn't just intelligence. It was personal. She sat down and wrote to George, now stationed with the OSS in Bari, Italy. Her letter was brief but urgent, stating, quote, "There are hundreds. Can you do something for them? It would be great if they are evacuated." George Vujnović was born in Pittsburgh to Serbian immigrants and studied at the University of Belgrade. During World War II, he joined the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later evolve into the CIA. The OSS had heard whispers, but nothing this clear. The letters confirmed their suspicions, and Mirjana's words gave them weight. From Brindisi, Vujnović began to act. Roosevelt personally vetoed Vujnovic's request to go himself, but he trained agents to pass as locals and not reveal themselves as foreigners. Vujnović later recalled, quote, "They were carrying Camels and Lucky Strike cigarettes and holding U.S. currency. I told them to get rid of it. I had to show them how to tie their shoes and tuck their laces in like the Serbs did, and how to eat like the Serbs, pushing the food onto their fork with the knife." While plans were forming in Italy, Claire Musgrove's journey through Serbia continued. Local shelter. Musgrove landed, rolled, and moved cautiously toward the herd. 2 women and 2 boys were tending it. No one spoke. He hesitated, aware that other downed airmen had been beaten or handed over, sometimes by villagers enraged by the bombings. He'd heard stories of shotguns, pitchforks, and angry crowds. He watched. They watched. Minutes passed in silence before the women finally motioned. He followed. They led him to a village. Musgrove noted that, quote, "They were very generous. They didn't have much food for themselves, but they were willing to share it." Later, there was a knock at the door, followed by a quick, hushed exchange of voices. Musgrove's host led him into a bedroom and, without a word, gestured for him to crawl under the bed. Night fell, and another visitor arrived. The floor shook with the sound of heavy boots, black, polished, unmistakably German. Voices muttered. The tension in the house grew thick. Finally, the men left, and Musgrove began to breathe easier. At dawn, 2 Chetnik soldiers appeared. Musgrove described the uncertainty, quote, "I stood pat and didn't know whether to follow them or not. They turned around and motioned for me to follow them, and I did. Days passed as they traveled on foot. They didn't speak English. There were no explanations." But Musgrove's experience in the hands of the locals was hardly unique, as one Chetnik fighter, who was just 16 at the time, explained, quote, "The Germans would jump in their trucks and tanks and chase their parachutes to the mountainside. We organized the peasants to pick up the guys, bury the parachute into the ground or into the hay so the Germans would not see it. Then we guerrillas would be taken by the peasants to where we hid those guys." Eventually, his Chetnik guides led him to a local school teacher who spoke basic English, just enough to confirm that there was a gathering point for airmen. The march continued another day. Recalling that moment, Musgrove said, quote, "The next day I met a man on horseback, and he could speak very good English. He told me he was Captain George Mussolin, who was in charge of the US OSS group helping the Chetniks gather us to a central base, and they were going to build an airstrip and come in and fly us out." The OSS arrives. On the night of August 2nd, 1944, the silence over Pranjani broke with the soft thump of parachutes hitting dirt. Through the darkness, General Mihailović's men rushed forward, embracing the Americans like brothers, tears mixing with sweat and dust. At the center of the welcome stood Mihailovich himself, commander of the Chetniks, waiting to greet the three-man OSS Halyard mission team. Mihailovich led Musulin through the hills to meet more than 250 downed airmen, hidden in 6 separate groups and protected by villagers. With the airmen accounted for, the next challenge loomed impossibly large, getting them off the ground and on their way home. In early March 1944, Mihailovich gave the order to begin constructing an airstrip near the village of Pranjani, a remote clearing that would have to serve as the escape route for downed Allied airmen scattered across Yugoslavia. At the site, 25 pilots were already waiting under tight guard, with more arriving each week. The airmen had found Golovicha Meadow, a relatively flat hilltop clearing dotted with boulders, bordered by forest on one end and a steep drop-off on the other. But the surrounding terrain made machine access impossible. Every inch of the strip would have to be cleared and leveled by hand. One of Mihailovich's captains led the construction, with over 100 local villagers and Chetnik fighters working mostly at night to avoid detection. As military aircraft expert Dick Dazo explains, quote, "Using ox wagons, the peasants would go to the nearby stream bed, get rock and sand, and bring the stuff up the hill to the runway site, in this never-ending daisy chain." The American airmen didn't sit idly. Despite their injuries and exhaustion, many joined the effort, digging and hauling alongside Serbian peasants. They cut down trees, filled potholes, and removed stones by hand. It was punishing work, and progress was slow. By late March, Mihailovich received the report. The airstrip was nearly operational. Brigadier General Houston of the 3rd Air Force would later observe, quote, "Everyone in the village turned out to level the airfield and expand it to make the airlift possible. Due to the courage and self-sacrifices of the Serbian people of this region, these airmen survived." On August 8, 1944, after 6 grueling nights of backbreaking labor, the improvised airstrip atop Golovicha Meadow was ready. Measuring 2,100 feet long and 150 feet wide, it could carry a fully loaded C-47 transport, just enough to evacuate 25 men per flight. On the far end loomed the tree line. Ahead, mountain peaks waited 2 miles away. Nothing Allied pilots couldn't handle. And so the first lift-out was set for August 9th. First flight. Musulin and the OSS team radioed the signal. The men were in position, and it was time to begin the extraction. No one dared to say whether it would work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a tense hush fell over the assembled group. American airmen stood shoulder to shoulder with Serbian villagers, rough-hewn faces streaked with dirt, hands calloused from digging the makeshift runway by hand. Bonfires crackled along the edges of the strip, casting flickering shadows that danced against the encroaching darkness. Red flares hissed upward, stabbing the black sky like warning lights. The night pressed in close, the silence thick, except for the pounding of anxious hearts and the distant rustle of leaves. Then, faint but unmistakable, a low, throaty rumble of engines. Musgrove remembered vividly, quote, "At precisely 10 p.m., the first transport approached, a black C-47 with a white star on its tail. Its landing gear made contact too far down the runway, so the pilot applied power and pulled up. We thought that was the end of the mission that night." But the tension was far from over. The second pilot wasted no time. He drove the plane down the narrow strip, the end rushing toward him like a wall. The aircraft twisted hard on one wing, scraping the ground, bending under the strain. But somehow he held it together. The plane remained airworthy. One American lieutenant, watching the unfolding scene, felt the tight knot in his chest loosen for the first time in days. He recalled, quote, "It was a tremendous thrill to see them coming in, because we knew that things were underway to get us out of there." Yet, a troubling realization settled over the group. 8 C-47s had been planned for the rescue, but only 4 appeared in the darkening sky. Each landing carried the weight of success or failure. The dirt strip had to hold firm under the heavy planes, and any hard or noisy touchdown risked alerting German patrols nearby. The men's eyes darted anxiously between the sky and the fragile runway, knowing that one mistake could doom them all. The weakest, the sickest men were loaded first, faces pale and drawn, but hopeful. Engines roared to life, brakes held tight, as throttles pushed forward, and then the plane screamed down the strip, disappearing over the hill's edge. Seconds later, their silhouettes climbed into the inky night. Finally, 48 men were airborne. But more than 200 still crouched in the shadows, their breaths held tight, eyes fixed on the black sky, waiting, praying that more planes would return before dawn. The Great Evacuation. Before dawn on August 10, 1944, the largest evacuation of Operation Halyard was underway. In the forest near Pranjani, the Allied airmen waited silently. Their safety had been secured through the relentless effort of Mihailovich, who ensured they were sheltered, treated, and protected. German patrols roamed nearby, yet not one airman had been captured under his watch. Soon, more American C-47 transport aircraft began arriving. Chetnik forces kept the landing strip clear and well marked, while guards held the perimeter. Despite the danger, order was maintained. The airmen were moved out in groups of 20, each escorted to the planes. Ground security held firm, even as the operation stretched into daylight. As they boarded the planes, many airmen made one final gesture of gratitude. Musgrove described the scene, quote, "The Chetniks and Serbians had very poor clothing and shoes. They wore boots made out of felt and things like that, so when we got on the plane, we kicked our shoes off to them." In the days that followed, more evacuations took place, first from Pranjani, then from new airstrips at Košeljeva and Boljanic, flying out hundreds more Allied personnel. By the end of Operation Halyard, 417 Allied airmen had been rescued from Chetnik-held territory, including 343 Americans. Each time, Mihailovich refused to leave. Despite being urged to escape, knowing he was a prime target for the Germans, he insisted on staying with his men, unwilling to leave them in their moment of need. A hero silenced. As the war wound down in 1944, Draza Mihailovich found himself abandoned by the very forces he once believed would support him. The Yugoslav government in exile withdrew its backing and shifted support to Tito's communist partisans. On August 29th, King Peter II dissolved Mihailovich's command by royal decree. In September, Mihailovich met with OSS Colonel Robert McDowell, who spoke of future support. But on September 12th, King Peter urged all Yugoslavs to join Tito, effectively disavowing Mihailovich. Many Chetniks deserted. In November, McDowell offered him a seat on an evacuation plane. Mihailovich refused, still hoping for a reversal. What he didn't know was that a Soviet-aligned double agent had steered British intelligence toward Tito. The British leaned on the Americans to follow, sealing his fate. By early 1945, his forces were shattered. In 1946, he was captured, tried, and executed, alone and betrayed. After Operation Halyard, the U.S. buried his role, even as Truman quietly awarded him the Legion of Merit. The citation, awarded in secrecy, read, quote, "Through the undaunted efforts of his troops, many United States airmen were rescued and returned safely to friendly control." George Muselin was expelled from the OSS for violating orders, but was later cleared and honored. In 2004, Claire Musgrove returned to Pranjani for the 60th anniversary, where a memorial plaque was unveiled. A year later, Mihailovich's Legion of Merit was finally presented to his daughter, Gordana, with Musgrove and other veterans in attendance. The story stayed quiet until 2010, when George Vujnovich, who helped run the mission, finally spoke to the New York Times, telling the paper, quote, "We didn't lose a single man. Even in Serbia, they don't much know about it."